I told myself it was just another meeting, just another project that needed managing, but the moment he stepped into the sunlit office, the air shifted. The room didn't feel like a room anymore. It felt like the space between us, charged, taut, alive. He was young. Too young, maybe. And yet every step he took carried a confidence that made my own pulse catch. White shirt, sleeves casually rolled, top button undone as if he had no care for appearances. And yet everything about him demanded attention. I kept my back straight, my voice steady, but I could feel him watching me. Not overtly, not with crude interest, but with an intensity that made me aware of every detail. The way my hair fell across my collarbone, the slight tension in my jaw, the way my fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the desk. Each movement, each micro-expression, felt amplified under the scrutiny of his gaze. He smiled when our hands brushed, a brief professional touch that lingered just a heartbeat too long. I felt the heat in my chest and I chastised myself silently. I am not like this. I am in control, always in control, and yet his presence demanded a different rhythm, a different awareness, as though the world had quietly shifted around us. The office was flooded with sunlight that day, dust motes floating lazily in the golden beams, and yet the brightness seemed only to highlight the tension coiled between us. He leaned against the edge of the desk, one foot casually crossed over the other, watching me explain the project details with a patience that surprised even me. But every so often his eyes would flick to my lips, or linger on my hands, and a part of me wanted to pull him closer, to feel the warmth that radiated from him, unspoken and electric. I reminded myself this was professional. It was supposed to be professional, and yet, when he laughed at a dry comment I made, the sound of it deepened the tension, wrapping around me like a coil I could not escape. I found my sentences breaking in unexpected ways, a stutter here, a softer inflection there. I caught myself noticing the curve of his jaw and profile, the slight shadow his lashes cast on his cheek, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the desk when he was thinking. "You always manage to make the impossible seem effortless," he said, his tone casual, but there was a note in it, a subtle challenge, as if he was testing me. I tilted my head, careful not to betray the fluttering heat in my chest. "I have to," I replied, and I kept my gaze firm, even though I wanted to see him closer, to bridge the distance that neither of us dared to acknowledge. His laughter came again, low and teasing, and this time he stepped a fraction closer under the pretense of examining the documents. Just a fraction, but close enough that the air around us seemed to vibrate. I swallowed, trying to focus, to remain the composed, commanding woman I had always been. Yet the brush of his shoulder as he leaned in made me acutely aware of my own heartbeat, and I could feel my resolve waver, just a little. The subtle choreography continued. My pen, accidentally dropped, gave him the perfect excuse to bend down in that slow, deliberate way that left me breathless. His hand lingered briefly over mine as he handed it back, a touch so fleeting, yet so pointed that my fingers trembled imperceptibly. I cleared my throat, lifted my chin, and forced myself to step back. Control, I reminded myself. Always control. And yet, control felt fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a ledge. He was everywhere I did not expect him to be. His presence made the ordinary, a desk, a chair, the sunlight on the wall, feel charged with possibility. Every glance, every subtle movement carried a weight neither of us admitted aloud. I caught him staring once when he thought I wasn't looking, and I felt a shiver of recognition that we were both aware of what was happening, what was building, but neither of us wanted to name it. Later, as we walked down the long corridor, our shoulders brushed again. I could feel him in my periphery, a shadow, a presence that drew me toward him against all reason. "Are you always this meticulous?" he asked softly, so close that I felt the warmth of his breath, the faint tang of his cologne. I smiled carefully, because to admit anything else would have been dangerous. "I am precise," I replied, but my voice carried a tremor, a hint of the awareness that my heart had betrayed me. The cafeteria later that day became its own arena of subtle tension. We sat across from one another, sun streaming in through the glass walls, highlighting his striking features, the way his white shirt clung casually to his form. the undone button hinting at a careless sensuality I had no right to notice. Yet I did, and he did not look away. Conversation became a careful dance, each word chosen, each pause loaded with meaning. He asked about my life outside work, a topic I usually deflected, and I found myself revealing just enough to feel the spark of connection, just enough to feel that I mattered to him beyond the professional veneer. And then his hand, brushing against mine while reaching for his coffee, sent a jolt through me, as though the entire room had contracted, focusing solely on the electricity of that small contact. The day continued in this silent duel, a series of gestures, glances, and unspoken questions. His presence made every mundane task feel intimate, every meeting feel like a scene rehearsed for an audience of two. I reminded myself repeatedly that it was forbidden, that the age gap, the circumstances, the potential consequences were reasons to maintain distance. And yet, distance became impossible when every glance held the promise of something more, when every brush of skin or fleeting smile hinted at a world I was not supposed to enter. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the office floor, the tension between us was unbearable. I found myself lingering at my desk, waiting for him to finish reviewing a report, knowing I could not leave without feeling the absence of him keenly. He noticed me, of course. He always noticed. And when our eyes met, the silence stretched, loaded with the weight of all we were trying not to acknowledge. "Do you ever stop?" he asked suddenly, leaning casually against the edge of the desk, that familiar crooked smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Stop what?" I asked, though my voice betrayed the truth I tried to hide. "Looking like you own everything," he said softly, his gaze locking with mine, daring me to challenge him. I drew a slow breath, resisting the pull, and yet inside, I felt that my resolve was unraveling. The moment lingered, stretched by sunlight and silence, until finally he stepped closer, just enough to close the distance between us without breaking any formal boundary. The air was electric, and I could feel it in my bones. A magnetic pull that neither of us wanted to name but both felt acutely. The world outside the office ceased to exist. It was just us, just this charged space, teetering on the edge of something forbidden and intoxicating. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to remind myself that desire was a dangerous thing, especially when it blurred lines that should remain clear. And yet, when he held my gaze that long, that unflinching, I realized something undeniable. This was no longer harmless. This was no longer a professional infatuation. It was fire, simmering beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed us both. He left the office minutes later, but the tension remained. I traced the space where he had been, feeling the lingering warmth of his presence. I tried to focus on my work, to regain composure, but I was acutely aware that nothing about that day had been ordinary. Everything had shifted, and I knew, deep down, that when we met again, nothing would be the same. The sunlight faded slowly, and with it, the illusion that I was still in control. I had tried to maintain distance, tried to deny the pull between us, tried to convince myself that it was nothing. But the truth, unspoken, undeniable, was staring back at me in the quiet hum of the office. This connection, forbidden and impossible as it was, had already claimed me. And that realization, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure, was only the beginning. I had convinced myself I could resist him. I had rehearsed every argument, every boundary I would enforce. I had told myself countless times that it was only desire, fleeting and unimportant. But resistance is an illusion when the other person knows your rhythm, your pauses, your silences. He knew exactly how to push, exactly where to linger. And I, stubborn as I was, found myself leaning into it anyway. It began with the small things, shared glances across the office, a hand brushing mine as we passed, the subtle proximity that seemed accidental but was anything but. Every encounter was a test, a negotiation, and I was losing without even realizing it. He had a way of looking at me that stripped away my armor in a glance, a tilt of his head, a soft smile that made me question every rule I had set for myself. I caught myself smiling at his jokes, even when they were terrible. I noticed the way his black shirt hugged his shoulders when he leaned forward, and the slight tension in his jaw when he thought I wasn't watching. I tried to focus, to remind myself that this was dangerous, that I was too old, that he was too young, that this was a line I should never cross. But my control was slipping, slowly, deliciously. One afternoon he appeared at my office door, casually leaning against the frame, arms crossed. "You look distracted," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. I tried to brush it off with a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Just a lot to do," I replied, though my chest tightened under his gaze. He stepped inside anyway, closing the door softly behind him. I should have asked him to leave. I should have reminded myself that this was wrong. Instead, I found myself noticing the faint scent of him, the subtle warmth of his body as he moved closer under the pretense of checking some papers. His eyes met mine, unflinching, and for a moment, the room was entirely his. And then, just like that, the distance I had built crumbled. Our conversations changed. We stopped skirting the edges of personal life and began touching it, gently, cautiously, as if testing waters that were too deep to swim in. He asked about my weekends, my hobbies, the small things that made me who I was, and I found myself sharing more than I intended, laughing at memories, revealing details about my life that I normally kept hidden. Each revelation was a confession, a surrender, and I realized I craved his presence more than I wanted to admit. The closeness became unbearable. In meetings, in hallways, even in passing, the air between us crackled. His hand brushing against mine in passing sent shivers down my spine. The way his eyes lingered when I spoke made my words falter, my voice catch. I was aware of every inch of space between us, every heartbeat that thudded a little faster when he was near. And I couldn't escape it. I didn't want to. One evening, long after the office had emptied, he lingered near my desk. The sun was dipping behind the skyline, casting golden light across the room, turning his silhouette into something almost dangerous in its allure. He looked at me, really looked, and I felt exposed, vulnerable, and more alive than I had in years. "You're thinking too much," he said softly, leaning just a fraction closer. His voice, quiet and low, reverberated through the space between us. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. About him, about the impossible pull, about the part of me that wanted to throw caution out the window. He tilted his head, studying me, as if reading the secrets I kept buried beneath professionalism and poise. "You," he said simply. The single word was enough to silence me. My chest tightened, my fingers twitched, and I realized I was holding my breath. I wanted to step back, to assert control, to remind myself that this was wrong, but I didn't. Not entirely. That night, I found myself thinking about the way he had looked at me, the way his hand had brushed mine, the way his presence lingered long after he left. I realized I was already surrendering, not in a reckless, impulsive way, but in a slow, inevitable surrender of my defenses, my careful boundaries. I was letting him in piece by piece, and it terrified me. Days passed like that. The tension between us became a language of its own. Subtle touches, lingering glances, conversations loaded with meaning. Each interaction deepened the connection, made it harder to maintain the facade of distance. And then one afternoon it happened. A conversation that started casually, about a report he needed my help with, ended with us sitting closer than ever, hands brushing repeatedly, hearts conspiring silently in a space where words were optional. "You can't fight it forever," he said quietly, not looking at me, but at the space between us, as if naming the unspoken truth. I swallowed hard. I'm trying," I admitted, my voice trembling in a way I had not expected. He finally looked at me, his eyes intense, unwavering. "Trying isn't enough," he said. It wasn't just physical tension anymore. It was emotional, raw, and undeniable. I found myself craving the weight of his gaze, the brush of his hand, the sound of his voice even when it was calm. And in those moments, I realized that control, my precious control, had already slipped. I was unspooling, unraveling in the way only desire, only connection, can make a person feel. One evening, as the sun poured through the office windows, he reached for my hand without hesitation. It was an act so simple, so deliberate, that I felt a jolt run through me. My heart pounded, my breath caught, and I realized I was holding my own hands together to prevent myself from pulling away. But I didn't. I let him hold it. Just that, a hand, and it was everything. We lingered there, neither speaking, both acutely aware of the electric intimacy of the moment. His fingers intertwined with mine, his thumb brushing softly over my knuckles. I felt the tension that had been building for weeks, months, years, dissolve in the quiet surrender of that touch. It was a surrender not of desire alone, but of the careful walls I had built around myself. I was letting him in, fully, irrevocably. From that moment, our dynamic changed. Every glance became more meaningful, every touch deliberate yet gentle, every conversation carrying the weight of unspoken confessions. I found myself leaning toward him without thinking, seeking his presence, needing his voice. The magnetic pull between us was undeniable, intoxicating, and every day it grew stronger. There was a particular afternoon, golden and vivid, when he leaned against the balcony rail outside my office. The city sprawled beneath us, bathed in sunlight, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. "You don't have to fight anymore," he said, voice low, warm. I swallowed hard, trying to muster the control I had clung to for so long, but it was gone. Gone with the sunlight, with the weight of his gaze, with the undeniable truth that I wanted him in ways I had long denied. I stepped closer, careful yet deliberate, and he didn't move away. The space between us disappeared, replaced by a quiet surrender, a mutual acknowledgement that what had started as forbidden tension had evolved into something far deeper. We were no longer adversaries in a silent battle of wills. We were co-conspirators in a connection that defied logic but felt entirely inevitable. It was in that surrender that I discovered a truth I had never admitted aloud. I had been resisting. Yes, but only because I feared the intensity of what I felt. The magnetism, the draw, the vulnerability, it terrified me. And yet, now that I let it in, I felt alive in a way that was impossible to ignore. Evenings became our sanctuary. We would sit in quiet proximity, sharing words that were unnecessary but meaningful, sharing silences that spoke volumes. The tension had shifted from unspoken desire to a deliberate intimacy, subtle, patient, and consuming. I discovered the comfort in surrender, the thrill in vulnerability, the power in letting someone see the parts of me I usually hid. Every interaction became a confession. Every glance a poem, every touch a dialogue without words. I realized that I didn't just want him, I needed him. Not in a reckless way, but in a way that anchored me, made me feel seen, made the walls I had built crumble under the weight of authenticity and desire. By the time Act 2 drew to a close, I was no longer fighting. Resistance had given way to something far more potent. Trust, intimacy, and the slow-burning recognition that what we had could not be contained. We were no longer two people on opposite sides of propriety. We were something more, something daring, something profoundly real. And in that surrender, I understood. The fire between us had not consumed me. It had awakened me. The world, I realized, was never going to let us have this quietly. There were rules, judgments, whispers of propriety and morality that seemed to follow me like shadows. And yet, standing on the terrace of my apartment as sunlight spilled across the city, I no longer cared what anyone thought. Because the truth, the undeniable, heart-stopping truth, was that he had become indispensable to me. It began subtly. A friend's raised brow when he appeared at my apartment for a late coffee, the way colleagues exchanged knowing glances when he showed up in the office, the occasional text from someone who had noticed too much. The external world was testing us, probing the edges of our fragile intimacy, and I felt the tension in my chest spike every time. But this time I didn't step back. This time I faced it. He was there with me when the whispers began. That quiet, confident presence that had once made me tremble, now anchoring me. He reached for my hand instinctively, thumb brushing over mine, and I realized that in this moment, we were unshakable. Together we had passed the threshold from forbidden tension to shared vulnerability, and nothing anyone said could undo that. One morning, As we walked through the sunlit streets of the city, the energy between us was palpable. People passed, absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the electric bubble we carried. The air was warm, the sunlight soft and golden, and I felt a rare sense of peace that came only when I was fully seen, fully known. "I hate that people judge us," I murmured, voice low, almost confessional. He tilted his head, brushing his fingers lightly over mine as we walked. "Let them," he said simply, his voice steady, grounding. "We're not here for them." His words carried the weight of a promise. And in that promise, I found the courage I had always prided myself on. I no longer needed to fight the pull between us, to measure every gesture, to restrain the longing that had been building for months. We were no longer hidden. We were unashamedly ours. That afternoon, the tension of the world met the intimacy we had built. A client meeting, professional on the surface, was laced with subtle glances, fingers brushing, proximity that neither of us could resist. The thrill of the outside world's judgment was only intensified by our shared awareness. Each touch, each pause, each word was deliberate, charged with meaning. And yet, there was no shame in it. Only the delicious acknowledgement of a bond we had fought to maintain. Later, at my apartment, the sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden shadows across the living room. He stood by the balcony, the city sprawling beneath us, and I felt an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with longing. "You always make it seem so easy," I said softly, almost to myself. He turned, eyes locking with mine, and for a moment, the city fell away. "Easy?" he asked, voice low, warm. "No, it's never been easy. But it's worth it, every moment." I stepped closer, letting the distance dissolve, letting the unspoken words between us breathe. The sunlight caught his hair, highlighting the youthful curve of his jaw, the casual black shirt with its undone button hinting at effortless allure. And in that quiet, glowing moment, I understood that love, true love, was never neat or easy. It was daring, unpredictable, and completely consuming. We spent the evening in gentle surrender. Conversations that began as confessions moved into laughter, into comfortable silences, into moments where simply being near each other was enough. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the steady, grounding presence of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. The next day brought a test. An unexpected visit from someone who questioned my choices, who implied that this connection was inappropriate, reckless. I felt the old tension rise, the familiar instinct to retreat, but his hand found mine under the table. A subtle anchor, and suddenly, the world's judgment felt distant, almost irrelevant. "I choose this," I said quietly, and it was the first time I spoke the truth aloud. "I choose him." His eyes softened, a mixture of pride and relief, and I realized that choosing him meant more than just surrendering to desire. It meant claiming my own agency, my own happiness, without apology. And in that, there was freedom. Days later, we found ourselves on a sunlit rooftop cafe. City noise below, sunlight warming our faces. It was ordinary, yet it felt extraordinary. The kind of moment that lingers in memory, where laughter and conversation flow effortlessly, and the world seems to align just for you. He laughed at something trivial, his eyes crinkling, and I caught myself staring, drinking in every detail. He reached across the table, fingers brushing mine, and I let my hand rest in his. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" I asked, voice soft, reflective. "All the time," he said, squeezing my hand gently, "and I wouldn't change a thing, not one moment." It was then I realized that our connection had transcended desire and tension. It had grown into something steady, resilient, and profoundly intimate. We had navigated the storm of external judgment, internal hesitation, and the age gap that had once seemed insurmountable, and we had emerged not just unscathed but stronger, more deeply intertwined than I had ever imagined possible. The city below glimmered in sunlight, the noise fading to a gentle hum, and I felt a rare, radiant peace. I no longer feared the world's judgment, no longer questioned the appropriateness of our bond. What we had was real, chosen, and undeniably ours, And in that realization, I felt a lightness, a freedom I hadn't known in years. Later, as we walked home, hands intertwined, sunlight spilling across the streets, I realized that love had a rhythm of its own. It didn't need perfection, it didn't need external validation. It simply needed recognition, surrender, and the courage to embrace it fully. At my apartment, he lingered in the doorway, sunlight casting a golden halo around him. "I don't want to leave," he said quietly, the confession hanging in the air between us. "You don't have to," I whispered, stepping closer, letting the warmth of him envelop me. "Stay," and so he did. Sunlight fell across the floor, illuminating the quiet intimacy of the moment. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just two people fully present, fully surrendered, fully alive. We sat together, hands intertwined, hearts in quiet sync, knowing that what we had was rare, unshakable, and profoundly real. In the days that followed, we moved through the city together, sunlit streets, rooftop cafes, quiet parks, each moment ordinary and yet extraordinary because it was shared. Every laugh, every touch, every glance reinforced the truth that had become undeniable. We had chosen each other, and in choosing each other, we had chosen joy, love, and freedom. The final moment came one afternoon, as we stood on the balcony of my apartment, sunlight spilling across the skyline. He turned to me, fingers brushing my cheek, eyes soft and steady. "We made it," he said simply. "Yes," I whispered, a smile spreading across my face. "We did." And in that sunlight, with the city alive beneath us, I finally understood that love, true love, was worth every risk, every hesitation, every moment of fear. Because it had brought us here. Together, unafraid, fully surrendered, fully alive. We laughed then, quietly, softly, the kind of laughter that only comes after storms have passed. And in that laughter, in that warmth, in that shared sunlight, I knew this was only the beginning. Our love was no longer forbidden. It was ours, chosen, steady, real. And for the first time in years, I felt utterly, undeniably free. If this story pulled at your heartstrings, drop a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to hit subscribe to follow the journey and never miss the next chapter of passion, tension, and love.